This is a short intro and overview of the field and discipline of communication studies. We're looking at Chapter 2 that examines the traditions and contexts of communication studies. So I'm just going to fly over those two. It's important for you as students of communication studies to understand how the discipline came to be and what the different parts of the discipline are today. I think it's also important as you think about future careers and occupations in communication studies that you understand the various avenues that you can go down. You can specialize in any number of the contexts that are mentioned in Chapter 2, and you can also specialize and find your grounding in some of the traditions, any one or number of the traditions that we're going to talk about. So if you remember from one of the previous videos, we talked briefly about the history of the field. I want to remind you of that the modern version of our field started in the early 1900s. In fact, it was in 1914 that a group of speech communication teachers split away from the National Society of English Teachers, and they formed the Speech Communication Association. And so the early formation of the field from an association and scholars coming together, teachers coming together, happened then. But really, before that, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were people investigating and thinking about communication problems. And as you can see, this tree or river, or however you want to conceptualize this, down the center of it, there's two different perspectives that have always been present in the field of communication. One is a humanistic view or a humanities view that understands the art or the language of communication. And then the other side of that is a scientific view. Scholars and people that wanted to think of communication as certain variables that you wondered how the variables influence each other in more of a scientific or experimental manner. And so in the early years, 1900 to 1950, you had a group of scholars that came out of the English side of that of the discipline, and then another group of scholars that really came out of disciplines like sociology and psychology. Media studies really formed on its own in the later, early 1900s, 1930 to 60, as you see on the slide there. And so these people were actually in other departments at universities, but they were exploring communication phenomena. As early as World War I, there were communication scholars in these other departments that were tackling the notion of propaganda. Not only how to cut through propaganda, but also how to create propaganda and influence people. These people were very interested, and the government sponsored research on propaganda and influence and things that today have become kind of the cornerstone of public relations studies. And as you'll see, there are a lot of other disciplines that communication has drawn upon for scholarly inspiration and some of the work of scholars that has developed into distinct communication avenues of research. So in Europe, there are a number of precursors to communication. Freud and his ideas on social cognition. How do we make sense of the world and then communicate about that? Even in the sciences, Darwin was very influential in what he observed in animal species and what we drew from that to understand human behavior, and especially nonverbal behavior. Marx and Habermas, another German communication scholar, really a sociologist, those two names very influential in the area of critical studies. Early propaganda, I mentioned some of there was a Committee for Public Information that was a government agency that was understanding or developing concepts and techniques in propaganda. Harold Laswell was very influential in that area. Carl Hovland was, you could consider him kind of an early scholar and pioneer in the interpersonal field, but again interested in social influence and how that impacted, how you could create messages that would impact people. Walter Lippmann, often thought of as one of the pioneers of the public relations field, got his start in propaganda, media effects studies, things like that. Paul Lazarsfeld as well, early pioneer in mass comm effects. For example, one of the most influential early studies was sponsored by a philanthropic organization called the Pain Fund. And because of the concern over the influence of media on youth, particularly film on youth and kind of emotional responses of youth to film, violence in film, etc. They sponsored a series of 13 studies that really married social psychology with media effects research. And so a lot of these researchers were involved in those kinds of studies, asking questions about what is the impact of continued exposure of violence to the young minds that were consuming this kind of content. Kurt Lewin, a sociologist that really influenced the field of small group communication, group dynamics. Another, Robert F. Bales, another name in there that became an early pioneer in group communication in the 1950s. And so we drew on a lot of different scholars. And so you can see that English, we've talked about the influence of English and how the speech teachers split away from English, the early ideas in rhetorical analysis, public speaking, even semiotics, understanding images and signs and how we are influenced by different kinds of imagery and signs. Sociology has impacted our understanding of media effects and cultural studies. Critical approaches often come from different sociologists' perspectives. And psychology has been hugely influential in the field of interpersonal communication. A lot of overlap in some of the theories and perspectives that we think about and use to explain behavior. And even science fields like engineering, computer software engineering, the idea of cybernetics. In fact, one of the early scholars, and we're going to talk about this scholar when we talk about the cybernetics tradition, was an electrical engineer and really had no intention or desire to understand the meaning of messages, just wanted to understand the capacity for a channel in messages. And the way that you increase capacity was to reduce uncertainty, noise in the channel. And a lot of our early models of communication were influenced by that cybernetic tradition and some of these folks that came from fields completely outside of communication. And so our use of systems perspectives and network perspectives today were influenced by engineering and different areas of engineering. Your text is going to talk to you about 7 traditions, and it's nice that there are both in the text, they talk about 7 traditions that the field of communication has drawn upon, and really the theories, the base of theories in comm. Almost every theory can be placed in one or combination of these traditions. And then there are 7 contexts primarily that we look at and study. And those are large contexts when we get to those. They're kind of generalized contexts. But it's nice that you've got 7 of one and 7 of the other. So it's easier to kind of hang on to 7 things and hook them on these hooks, these ideas. And so these contexts, or rather traditions, are really important, and I want you to wrap your brains around these traditions. We'll talk more about and use these traditions in class. The contexts are a little bit different than these traditions, but you can see how each context has drawn upon and uses some of these different traditions. Your text has a nice image that gives some examples of these different contexts that I've inserted here, and I'll just quickly overview these. So you've got intrapersonal, which is the idea that there's communication that happens within myself, communication with oneself, and everything from research on internal monologues to impression formation to self-perception. One of the early theories that we're going to look at, symbolic interpretivism, draws its roots from intrapersonal, the idea that we use symbols and meaning to make observations and attributions. Attribution theory, both in psychology as well as in communication, kind of resides in this interpersonal sphere. And then interpersonal, here we're talking about when two or more people come together and interface or interact. So you've got everything from relational influence, relational formation, relational maintenance, conflict, interpersonal attraction. There's privacy management theory. There's all kinds of theories in the interpersonal realm. That's a fascinating field of study. And these theories and information in this area, super influential in careers when you're going to be coming in alongside people in helping professions, whether it's in ministry, or counseling, or nonprofit work, and you're working alongside certain communities and you really want to understand them and the relationships and how those relationships have impacted their lives. And then small group research, again, this came along really in the 1940s, 1950s. I mentioned Kurt Lewin, R.F. Bales, and understanding when you get groups of people together in groups and teams and how those groups, everything from how they form and become a unit that has cohesiveness to how teams and groups are productive and are accomplish more work than they would if it was just individuals trying to do the same thing. So huge area of research in organizations and businesses and things like that. Organizational group kind of spills over once groups form a system or a structure that becomes an organization. Now you can begin talking about large corporations and units that have an identity really aside from a small group and a group of people. And so we begin thinking about power and hierarchy and networks and really the culture within an organization. And organizations often produce communication themselves, so we can begin thinking about public relations and public influence, propaganda coming from an organizational or institutional source. So that's really one of the more, out of all of these, this is the first one that really has its life inside the professional realm, in the sense that organizational communication really got its start when we started thinking about institutions and institutional communication, and we started becoming interested in organizational effects. And then there's public rhetorical as a context, public speaking, criticism of artifacts like texts, speeches, today videos even, and messaging just in general, thinking about messages and how people are influenced by messages, how they can create messages that are then influential. Communication apprehension is a part of this area. Becoming a skilled public orator is part of this area. Media, the texts talk about mass media, and really media is it's not so much mass anymore. It's as often one-to-one as it is one-to-many, and we need to remember that we're talking about mediated effects these days, not just mass media. It's not ABC, NBC, and CBS that are king of the hill anymore. It's you as a content creator and developing your channel on Instagram or YouTube or TikTok and that media effect. But still, we're thinking about how either one-to-many or one-to-one messages have an effect on people and in all of the different channels. So whether it's social media or traditional broadcast media or new and emerging media, channels that we don't even know exist yet, that's what this field is interested in. And then intercultural, sociocultural/intercultural, thinking about how culture shapes and forms us and how we then can interact together through those, what we might think of as cultural barriers or boundaries. And everything from how ethnocentric we are and attitudes that we possess keeps us from interacting successfully, to the anxiety we feel to crossing those barriers. A very influential theory in intercultural by a mentor. It wasn't a direct mentor of mine, but he was a mentor of sorts in my own writing and thinking. Bill Gutekunst had a theory that was called anxiety uncertainty management. And it's the idea that when we cross a cultural barrier, there's a little bit of anxiety that's generated because of the uncertainty and unfamiliarity of that terrain. And as I try to reduce the uncertainty, my anxiety will fall, and then I will become more competent as I cross cultures and try to communicate. So those are the 7 traditions and 7 contexts of communication. We'll work more with these in class, and I'll see you then.